So you think you don't need to be concerned about environmental issues if you're a multifamily investor. Well, you're sort of right, but actually you're wrong. So let's talk about why and 7 key things that you need to know as a multifamily investor about environmental things. So this is actually much more common as we go forward in today's complicated world, and you need to make sure as an investor you're protected. So anytime you buy a new multifamily property, you need to consider if you should have a desktop or phase one environmental study done. Now, if you're getting bank financing, almost all the time they're going to require at least a desktop review because it's a very smart preventative measure to make sure that there's no concerns about the property. So you might say, but it's an apartment building. Why would there be a problem? Well, more common than you think. So a lot of the time it's actually because of what's around it. So I actually sold a property that it didn't seem like there'd be anything wrong with it, but it was 30 years ago. There was a gas station 3 properties over, and that gas station leaked gas into the ground because of the underground tanks. And then that, of course, flowed in the groundwater underneath the property that my investor was purchasing, and leaving him to have a property that had contaminated soil underneath it. So you never know what is going on around unless you have a study done. So just take that as a word of caution. Not that expensive if you get a desktop review. A phase one is essentially everything they do in a desktop review, except they actually go out to the property as well and walk around and just monitor it. But usually with an apartment building, if you don't have otherwise concern, you're probably okay with getting a desktop done, and you'll be very grateful, and it'll be money well spent if they do happen to uncover a problem. So the second thing that you should keep in mind is that a lot of buildings nowadays have asbestos in them unless they're newer construction property. Now, asbestos generally are not a problem unless they are opened up to the air. So oftentimes it's insulation around pipes. If they're properly encapsulated, not an issue, but the moment you open things up and start doing renovations, repairs, things like that, you need to make sure it's properly remediated so that you don't have issues and, of course, liability as a landlord later. The third one is lead. And while that's very, very common, everyone's like, yes, we know about lead. If the property was built before 1978, there's a standard disclosure that tenants must be aware that there could be lead-based paint in the property. But a lot of times this is an issue because you have peeling paint, and if it kind of gets breathed in through the air, that can become a hazard. And then also if you have pipes that have lead in them that are carrying the public water into the property, and then people are drinking the public water, and especially children are subject to having higher lead levels. So a lot of municipalities are starting to crack down on this, especially if it's a city that has a lot of older housing stock. And you as a landlord are responsible for making sure it is properly remediated, or you could face substantial fines. So make sure that lead in either the pipes or the paint is not something that you ignore. And if you're purchasing a building, that has been properly remediated so it's not on you as the next owner. The fourth one is mold. And mold, although it's not a substance that's really monitored by a federal regulation, it's becoming an increasing problem because more and more people are developing allergies and sensitivities to it. So you could have a tenant in a building that gets sick continually and don't know why. If they established that there's mold growing in your building and you knew about it and did nothing, that can really be a big liability. So make sure you're just taking the precaution to keep things dry and clean up any mold that you see right away. It's usually not a hard thing to do to remediate it, and you'll avoid a lot of problems down the road. The fifth one is tanks in the ground or in the basement. So it's very common that there used to be heating oil put in tanks, sometimes buried in the ground, very often in basements. Anytime you're aware of a tank, make sure it's empty just so that you don't get stuck as an owner for the liability of that oil. because even if it leaked years down the road, you could still be liable as the owner if you knew about a problem and didn't clean it up or do something about it. So be very careful anytime you're talking about tanks, making sure they're clean and there's not a problem, especially if they've been buried in the ground. The sixth one is flooding, and unfortunately in today's world, flooding is becoming more and more common, even in areas that have not been considered a floodplain before. So especially if you have a property near or is actually in a floodplain, be very careful, because you'll go back to the mold problem if you encounter an issue with it. And those floodplains are actually adjusted every so often. FEMA adjusts those floodplain maps. So if you're anywhere close to it, just anticipate there could be an issue down the road, and make sure that you're taking proper precautions to have grading properly set up around your property, and do everything you can to avoid and monitor that flood risk. And then indoor air is one that's really been brought up since COVID-19. And people expect that there's a certain quality of indoor air and are concerned about what may be in the air that they're breathing, with a lot of chemicals that they put in new carpet nowadays and things like that. So be aware and conscious, and if you can put in any type of air monitoring or air filters for your tenants, that's something that's not hard to do, but will definitely be a bonus to your tenants and can help to protect you from future liability as well. So I hope you don't have any of those challenges, but if you do, make sure you stay ahead of them, and your future investor self will be sure to thank you. I hope this video brought you some value. If so, please like, comment, and share. And if you're looking for investment property within Pennsylvania or Maryland, please reach out.